Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Did Shakespeare. My name is Cassidy Cash, and this month of October, we're going to be diving into the history of William Shakespeare to take a look at where his history overlaps with the Native Americans that were living in colonial America. Obviously, it wasn't colonial America when they lived there, but people like Pocahontas and Squanto were a part of William Shakespeare's life. And since that is an underexplored area, I thought it would be fun to take a look at where and why and to tell some of these stories. But we're going to start actually not on the continent itself, but off in the islands of Bermuda and the Bahamas to take a look at the island natives that were often confused in early modern England and put together, even though they are not, but they found out they were different kinds of people later. For William Shakespeare, all of the island natives were kind of the same thing. So this week, we are asking the question, did Shakespeare write Caliban as an Indian? So I suppose we should start by explaining who Caliban is. And Caliban is the creature on the island in The Tempest when Prospero is shipwrecked and he goes to the island that he lands on. He discovers this Indian living there. And this is the language that William Shakespeare's play uses to describe this character. And he is considered not very trustworthy. He's given a very ugly, very villain reputation for the sake of the play. Obviously, the play had to have its villain, but it tells us what Shakespeare understood as an Indian. And you can look at the way that he talks about Caliban and some of the features he gives him in the play and some of the words that he chooses in the dialogue to learn kind of what London's understanding of the Indians in the islands and the Native American tribes that they were encountering in North America, kind of what the stories were coming back to London from those explorers. When we use the term Indian in context of Shakespeare's word, there's this fluidity in terms of meaning. Early international explorers like Columbus thought they had found India when they discovered native tribes in North America, and despite correcting their geographical error, the term itself continued to be used and became a 16th century synonym for indigenous people groups anywhere. Shakespeare himself would have known about indigenous people groups being discovered by English explorers like Sir Walter Raleigh because the sailors, the captains, and the teams who worked on these expeditions kept really great notes. They had ship logs and they wrote letters home, and they had to keep records for the official reports of their travels that they would turn in England and send back. And they would talk about what they had found because the reigning monarch had sent them on these expeditions. They were financing these expeditions for the good of England. And so these explorers had to prove what they were doing. So as they were keeping the monarch apprised of how their money and effort was being spent in the new expansive world they were trying to create and discover, they kept records of what was going on. These records were published back in London as public record, and so people like William Shakespeare could have read them. Historians who explore Shakespeare's play The Tempest, about a shipwreck which ends up on a mysterious island and encounters a native there, seem to agree that the character of Caliban was based on a Native American. Many people will tell you that the Isle of Illyria, where Caliban is found, is a purely fictional place, and I disagree with this assumption. And here's why. I question this conclusion because I think Shakespeare was actually conflating his own contemporary history with exploring new lands and finding Indians living there with a wild and mysterious place of unknowns, and the only concrete thing he had to associate that experience with, which was ancient Greece. In classical antiquity, Illyria was the name of a region in the western part of the Balkan Peninsula inhabited by numerous tribes of people. They were all native people and they were referred to as Illyrians. The area was inhabited at various times by people groups from what is now the United Kingdom, including the Celts. In Greek mythology, Galatea is identified as the parent to one of the rulers of Illyria and is the name of another early modern play by one of Shakespeare's contemporaries, John Lyly. Shakespeare was heavily influenced by Lyly's Galatea, and he based some of his other shipwrecked plays like Twelfth Night on Lyly's work. So it seems to me that the story of Illyria is not purely a fictional place that Shakespeare had dreamed up and set as the setting for The Tempest, which is how a lot of people seem to write about this play, but instead, Shakespeare was doing what Shakespeare does and borrowing from another person's story. He had read about Illyria in the stories of classical antiquity. He was reading about the stories of Indians from the explorations of people like Sir Walter Raleigh and John Rolfe. And he's putting all of this together into a fictional tale that became The Tempest and became Twelfth Night. There are even a few references to Indians in A Winter's Tale. While I don't think that Shakespeare's Illyria is based on the American colonies, nor is it purely fictional, I do think that Shakespeare infuses some of the current 16th century mindset about Native Americans into his character of Caliban. The name Caliban is actually thought to be a derivative of the word Carib, which is the name of the original inhabitants on the islands which were discovered by Columbus. In 1492, when Columbus discovered part of what is now known as the Bahamas, that he renamed San Salvador, he was accompanied by a cartographer named Juan de la Cosa, who was also the owner of the Santa Maria. And any American United States student will know that Columbus sailed on the Nina de Pinta and the Santa Maria, and that Santa Maria, Juan de la Cosa owned it. And so he was going on this journey with Columbus, and his job was to draw a map of the new places that they discovered as they moved through the ocean. Now, after they landed on the island in the Bahamas, Columbus described the island on paper, but his description is so vague that he could have been describing almost any island anywhere. He was literally like, there was dirt and there was water. And so for that reason, historians are unsure which part of the Bahamas Columbus is actually talking about, despite there being a current island in the Bahamas named San Salvador today. The interesting part about this history and connection to Shakespeare specifically is because of what happened in 1609. In 1609, the English explorer John Smith, yes, the Pocahontas John Smith, set out for the newly minted Virginia colony with a fleet of 9 ships. So during this journey, one of those 9 ships got separated from the fleet by a violent storm. It was called the ship Sea Venture, and it ended up on Bermuda. Now, if you look at a map, the Bahamas and Bermuda are far apart, but if you look at them in context of being over in England versus being in North America, the Bahamas and the Bermudas on a map are not that far apart, and the maps were notoriously awful in the 16th century. But this account of landing on the Bermudas after a violent storm was written about in pamphlets that were circulated in London. And historians tend to agree that these pamphlets were what Shakespeare used to write his play, The Tempest. When you look at a map of the Bermudas and Bahamas, they're physically almost 1,000 miles apart. But for someone who had never seen this part of the world like Shakespeare and only understood either the Bahamas or the Bermudas as, quote, islands in an ocean far away, which is likely all Shakespeare knew about them beyond the rather sketchy map provided by Juan de la Cosa, and even that map doesn't make them look very far apart, it's conceivable to think that the reputation of both places could have been combined by Shakespeare to form his opinion and reputation of Caliban. That's it for this week. That's the story of Caliban and John Smith, the expeditions in 1609, and a little bit about Columbus for your week. I hope you learned something new about William Shakespeare and a little bit about his world this week. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I'll see you next Saturday. Bye-bye.